Today we're talking about companies. People always understand companies in some way, shape or form, and they will generally understand XYZ Proprietary Limited. We're going to talk about the basic structure of a company so that it'll help you understand when people are talking about it exactly what that means. We'll talk briefly about the types of company that you can have. We'll talk about issued capital and shareholders. We'll talk about directors. We'll talk about secretaries. We'll talk about public officer, and we'll talk about the rules as they apply in Australia through the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. When we talk about types of company, there are a number of types of company that we can have, and you'll often see them, you'll look at a company name and it'll have proprietary limited or it'll have limited, and there's all these different sorts of things. So a private company is the one that's proprietary limited, and that's generally a smaller company that might operate a small business, etc. As I said, it'll have proprietary in it, and there's certain rules that are imposed by the corporations law that say you can't have more than 50 shareholders, you might only have one director, you might only have one shareholder. Generally smaller, easier to set up. Then we have what's called an unlisted public company. So this is a public company which will have XYZ Limited, so it removes the word proprietary from it. With a public company, you need to remember that you've got to have 3 directors. You can have as many shareholders as you like. So there's no restriction on the number of shareholders. As I said, 3 directors, and it's generally for companies that have got more people wanting to be involved, or where you've got a number of people who have been involved in a company as shareholders and they want to bring more people in. They'll often move from being a private company to a public company. One of the big differences between a private company and a public company is that if I hold shares in a private company, and I'm the director of that private company, I can choose to register or not register those shares to someone else. I can sell them to someone else, but at the end of the day I get approval as to who I sell them to. If I'm in a public company, be it listed or unlisted, if someone wants to sell their shares to anybody else, that just has to be registered. So in effect you can lose a little bit of control in your shareholding with regard to operating an unlisted public or a public company, and you'll often hear of, on the listed companies, unfriendly takeovers and all that sort of stuff, and that's because someone can go in and buy shares and effectively take over the company without any right of refusal by the directors of the company. Then we get to, so we've got an unlisted public company, which is generally a larger business type operation operating in the private sector. Then we'll have a listed public company. Now, listed public company is one that's listed on the stock exchange, the Australian Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, etc. So they've got a whole heap of rules, whole raft of rules that they have to comply with and abide by with regard to the Australian Stock Exchange, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. There's generally tighter rules on the operation of those. There's more onus on the performance of directors, etc., for those businesses. So we have the unlisted public companies. We have the listed public companies, and then occasionally you'll see on the stock exchange, you'll see XYZNL, which means no liability, and generally they're companies that have been set up in the mining industry, where there's a lot of inherent uncertainty as to whether they will continue on, whether their company's viable, and they're specific in certain industries. You don't see them very often, but as I said, generally in the mining industry. So whenever you see XYZNL, it means no liability. The final sort of company that we'll talk about today is a company limited by guarantee. So that'll be XYZ Limited, and when it says limited by guarantee, that means that instead of having shareholders and investors in the company, there are people that have come in and they say, look, if the company fails, we'll put in an amount of money. We guarantee that we will put in XYZ dollars, and that could be $20. So they'll have a range of people who agree to guarantee the company without actually putting share capital in, and oftentimes you'll find these companies in the charitable area, or you'll find them, I know for instance in Ballarat we've got Sovereign Hill, which is a company limited by guarantee. So I think there's 100 or so people who are the guarantors of Sovereign Hill, and if Sovereign Hill were to fail, they would put in their $20. So we've got a private company, we've got an unlisted public company, we've got a public company, we've got a no liability company, and we've got a company limited by guarantee. we'll start going through in more detail about shares and issued capital. When we talk about companies, whether they be private companies, proprietary limiteds, unlisted publics, limited, or listed public companies, limited, there's a thing that people understand that are called shares. You can buy shares in those companies. Occasionally you can be given shares in those companies. And that's called what's called the issued capital of the company. So these are shares that are issued, usually for money, and you hold them to hopefully get a return on the investment that you've made. Now, when we talk about shares, there can be all sorts of different classes of shares. So the people who set up the company can say, all right, we've got ordinary shares which participate in various things, which we'll talk about. You might have A-class shares, B-class shares, C-class shares. You might have cumulative preference shares. You might have all sorts of different shares. So when you're looking at the shares, you need to understand what the rights and participation that you get as a shareholder in the company that has issued those shares. So when we've got different classes of shares, it could be that those shares have a right to participate. There's basically three things that we can have a right to with regard to shares, and this is getting it really simple. We can have dividends, so that's a right for the company to pay the dividends, the profits out to the shareholders. There's a right to capital, so if the company gets wound up, you participate in your respective share of the capital, and there's also voting rights, which means that you get the shareholder gets the capacity to vote those shares at a general meeting or whatever meeting of shareholders is called. So when we've got you can have dividend shares which only pay you dividends and don't give you any rights to voting, don't give you any rights to capital. You can have capital only shares, you can have voting only shares. So you need to understand what your rights and obligations are as regards to those shares that you hold. When we get dividend participation, the general rules are if we've all got let's say ordinary dividends, then everybody who's got those ordinary dividends participates to their pro rata level in the distribution of those dividends. We can distribute dividends differently to ordinary shareholders as opposed to A-class shareholders as opposed to B-class shareholders. So you can be a little bit creative when you're setting up a company with regard to your capacity to direct income to certain parties, same with capital and same with voting. So when we're looking at the issued capital and shareholders of a company, we need to make sure we understand what we actually can do with those shares and what rights they bring with them. Now we talk about directors. Everybody seems to think that being a director of a company is a really, really good thing. As I said before, depending on the size of the company, there needs to be a minimum of 1 or a minimum of 3 for the public companies. A director has ultimate responsibility for control and direction of the company, and they have a responsibility to the suppliers, the creditors of the company, the employees of the company, the customers of the company, the shareholders of the company, anybody who deals with the company. They've got to comply with the various tax laws, they've got to comply with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission laws, they've got to comply with the work cover laws, they've got to comply with all these sort of laws. So everybody, I know there's a lot of people out there think that being a director of a company is a really, really sexy thing and it sounds great, but you need to be aware of the roles and responsibilities and obligations to you as a director. They are quite onerous, and there's been a number of occasions in recent times where directors of companies have been taken to court because they've been held not to have done the right thing by the employees, by the suppliers, by any of those sorts of things. So when we talk about being a director of a company, you need to understand that there is a lot of liability, potential liability, and responsibility that comes with that role. So before you take on a role of director, you need to understand exactly what that entails. The other position in a company is what's called a company secretary. Now, a lot of people think, oh, that's the person that takes the notes. Yes and no. The company secretary is basically the person who's responsible to make sure that the administration aspects of the company are run properly. They make sure that the Australian Securities Investment Commission rules are kept up to date. If they're listed companies, they make sure that all the Australian Stock Exchange rules are complied with and notification requirements are met. I know one of my good friends is actually a professional company secretary. That's what he does, and he makes sure that the companies for whom and with whom he acts comply with all their obligations, because as the company gets bigger and as it gets more complex, there's far more rules, requirements, obligations and duties that the company needs to abide by. So that's the role of the company secretary. The final official position within a company is a thing called a public officer. Now, the public officer, in real simple terms, is the person with whom the tax office will interact. So that's just someone that nominates to deal with the tax office. Now we're talking about the Australian Securities and Investments Commission rules, which apply to any company that is incorporated in Australia. A number of years ago, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, or the government, changed the law as it applies to companies, and they brought in what's called the Corporations Law. Now, that basically said for proprietary limited companies, there's these standard rules that most companies abide by, and they're what's called the replaceable rules. So it means that if there's any amendment to the Corporations Law, that companies automatically apply those amendments to their rules, rather than having to go and amend constitutions or the old memorandum and articles that used to apply years ago. So that makes it a lot easier nowadays for companies to comply with the legal aspects in the underlying basis of being a valid, incorporated, compliant company. Another rule that you've got for the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, or as we call it, ASIC, the ASIC rules is you need to keep your records up to date. So if there's a change of director, if there's a change of business place, if there's a change of shareholders, if there's a change of address of director, if there's a number of things that we need to notify ASIC of when they occur, and there's certain periods within which we need to notify them. I know we picked up a customer many years ago, and their ASIC rules, the ASIC reporting obligations hadn't been complied with for 18 years. There were people who were directors and shareholders who were dead. That caused a bit of a problem, and took us a bit of time to clean up the mess. But you need to make sure that those specific notification dates are complied with. Otherwise, the ASIC will ping you for late penalties. A company always has to do an annual return, which basically confirms all the details of the company to Australian Securities and Investments Commission, so that they know who the directors are, where they live, all that sort of stuff. So that's another obligation. And there's also a requirement in ASIC that once companies reach certain threshold levels on turnover, employees, etc., that there's a requirement for them to be audited. You can apply for exemption from audit, but you just need to be aware of that in the background once the company gets to a certain size. So, overview of the ASIC rules. The final aspect we're talking about today has to do with a little bit of the tips and traps for companies, and these creep up occasionally. We see them occasionally. Companies can participate in franked dividends, so you'll often see on the financial reports that BHP might have paid out a dividend and it's fully franked. That means it gets a credit for the tax that BHP has paid. So as it comes through, you get the tax credit flowing through to the shareholder. So they can be franked, or they can be unfranked, they can be partially franked, and there's specific rules around that. So just be aware when you're receiving dividends that there may or may not be franking credits. One of the other things that we occasionally find with companies is that they might pay dividends to people who aren't shareholders, which is a big no-no. So just make sure that before a company that you're involved with pays dividends, it actually pays it to the people who it's entitled to be paid to. Otherwise, there's a whole raft of issues that arise. You need to be aware of the taxation rules as they apply to companies, and there's some particular parts of the taxation legislation that only apply to companies. So you need to be very aware of what your obligations, duties and rights are with regard to that. There's an issue occasionally, or often actually, with companies when it comes to succession planning. So that's passing the control of the company through from one person to the next. The ultimate control of a company rests with the shareholders, because they can vote in and out the directors. So the directors notionally control the company, as we talked about earlier, but you need to make sure that we're passing control, the actual control of the shares, the ownership of the shares needs to transfer. And there's specific rules with that in Australia that relate to capital gains tax, so that all needs to be considered as part of the whole succession planning issue. With the capital gains tax, it's very important that the records are kept and kept up to date with regard to issue of shares, any redemptions, etc., any bonus issues that occur, because it can be really messy when you're coming back 10, 15, 20 years later and the records are incomplete. It becomes an absolute nightmare. So the main thing when we come to companies is that they can be very flexible. They're very good and very popular as far as a way to operate businesses. There are specific tax rules. You've got to make sure if you're a director you are aware of your rights, duties and obligations, and that you make sure that the company details are kept up to date and the company details are kept, and make sure that when there's changes you notify Australian Securities and Investments Commission. I hope that's helped.